Coming up on this Monday edition of Newsline at noon, a yellow dust warning remains in effect for Seoul and its surrounding regions after thick clouds of toxic smog blew in from China and Mongolia. The OECD warns Korea's sputtering shipbuilding industry could pose a wider risk to the Korean economy. The sector was hit hard by the 2008 global financial crisis. Plus, a bomb explosion during a peaceful pro-Kiev rally in eastern Ukraine kills 2 and leaves at least 10 more injured. This as Ukraine and pro-Russia rebels swap almost 200 prisoners. These stories and more on Newsline at noon. It's new Monday, February 23rd here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broome. And we start with the dangerously high level of air pollution that has blanketed skies above much of Korea. As you can see behind us, it is extremely dusty here in Seoul, and the usual skyline has receded somewhat into a dense greyish smog.
Right. Most people are saying they've never seen it this bad before. A lot of schools have canceled outdoor activities today, and people, especially with respiratory issues, are advised to stay indoors or wear a mask if they have to head out.
Certainly have to wear a mask if you do go outside. And for more on the yellow dust, let's connect straight away to our weathercaster, Eoh Jin-joo, who has the latest figures for us. It really doesn't make very pretty reading, does it, Jian?
Well, good afternoon, Mark and Jin-joo. Yes, you're right. Seoul is covered in a toxic haze of yellow dust. These are particles that blow across from China and Mongolia, and they contain lots of unpleasant stuff, including chemicals. So you don't want to be exposing yourself to it. And this yellow dust storm started coming in late yesterday afternoon and continue to get worse overnight, especially in Seoul. Now, this is the first yellow dust warning of the year. The warning has been issued for Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi-do province, and this is the first yellow dust warning issued in February in more than 5 years, and advisories are in place for most parts of the other parts of the nation. Now, the level of dust right now has decreased compared to previous hours, but still far higher than the unhealthy level, hitting well over 700 micrograms per cubic meter of air here in Seoul. And unfortunately, we are expecting to have this extremely high level throughout the day. And most forecasters say the worst should be over by Tuesday morning. And we hope to be approaching normal air quality by then. Well, that's all for now. Stay safe, everyone.
Now, the yellow dust hanging over the country at the moment can have a number of negative health effects, everything from eye irritation, sore throats, and even breathing and heart problems. And the smog affects Korea from time to time, but the country that bears the worst of it is China.
A lot of people would say China produces a lot of the pollution, of course, but we want to find out what the two countries, Korea and China, are doing to prevent this pollution problem from getting even worse than it is now. Our Eoh Jin tells us more.
It's the worst yellow dust storm in 4 years. The Korea Meteorological Administration issued yellow dust warnings in Seoul and other major cities throughout Korea this Monday morning. Every year, this unhealthy yellow haze drifts from China and Mongolia, carrying with it industrial pollutants and bacteria, none of which are good for your respiratory health. In response, weather authorities here advise people to stay indoors and wear a protective mask and goggles when going outside. But some might ask, why can't we stop the dust from drifting into Korea? What has been done to make this unwelcome guest go away? Korea and China have been working together for over a decade to fight the yellow dust. Public and private groups from both countries have been planting more trees in the deserts of China and Mongolia to slow desertification. The two countries have also established working groups to research ways to counter rising levels of dust pollution and installed high-tech air monitoring equipment. During an environment ministers meeting between China, Japan, and Korea last year, the ministers talked about each other's environmental policies and agreed to work together to tackle various environmental issues, with improving air quality topping the list. But experts say these efforts are being overwhelmed by China's enormous population and industries that still rely heavily on coal, leading to more air pollution. They say it's time for China to actively develop clean energy to use in place of coal, and for its neighboring countries like Korea to better cooperate with China, as environmental problems like yellow dust have consequences that reach far beyond the borders of any one country. Eoh Jin-joo, Arirang News.
The Korean government has further protested Japan's latest territorial claim to Korea's Dokdo Island. The Foreign Ministry summoned Kenji Kanasugi, a minister at the Japanese embassy in Seoul on Monday morning, to protest Japan's celebrations of Takeshima Day. Takeshima is the Japanese name for Dokdo. Now, for the third straight year, the Japanese government dispatched a senior official to Shimane Prefecture to attend the event. Korea denounced the move on Sunday, calling it historically regressive and one that raises doubts about Tokyo's sincerity to strengthen ties with Seoul. And speculation is growing that Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will address U.S. Congress when he travels to Washington later this spring. Sources in Tokyo say congressional leaders are leaning towards approving the move, but it's already facing resistance from Korean American groups. Now, these groups are saying Abe should first sincerely apologize for Japan's wartime atrocities before he is allowed to give such a high-profile speech. Sun Jung-in has the details.
A source familiar with the issue says Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will likely give a speech before U.S. Congress during his planned visit to Washington in late April or early May. The source said Abe strongly expressed his will to a congressional delegation from the U.S. who recently visited Tokyo. Many U.S. congressional leaders, including House Speaker John Boehner, are known to be leaning toward letting Abe speak to Congress. If Abe gets the green light, it will mark the first time a Japanese prime minister has addressed U.S. Congress in 54 years. Former Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda was the last Japanese leader to give a speech before the House of Representatives all the way back in 1961. Before that, Nobusuke Kishi addressed Congress in 1957 and Shigeru Yoshida in 1954. Abe reportedly wants to speak before a joint session of the lower and upper house, something no Japanese prime minister has ever done before. However, some obstacles stand in his way. Many Korean Americans are opposed to Abe's move, as he's expected to promote Japan as a country that has followed a peaceful path since the end of World War II. A task force for a Korean council in Washington for women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan said they launched a petition campaign on Sunday. They will submit a formal letter to California Congressman Ed Royce, saying they're opposed to the idea unless Abe makes a sincere apology over Japan's historical wrongdoings first. Sun Jung-in, Arirang News.
The United States is standing by its position of seeking dialogue with North Korea while firmly responding to the regime's provocations as and when they happen. Despite the usual two-track policy, Washington has seemingly been flip-flopping between a hardline stance and a softer approach in recent weeks. Chae-sun reports.
At the start of 2015, Washington slapped additional sanctions on Pyongyang for its alleged hacking of Sony Pictures late last year. In a State of the Union address later in the same month, however, President Barack Obama excluded any reference to North Korea. Then came the U.S. president's controversial YouTube interview in which he said the North Korean regime will eventually collapse as the internet penetrates further into the reclusive country.
And it is very hard to sustain that kind of brutal authoritarian regime in this modern world.
The State Department's official overseeing East Asian affairs days later said that bringing change to North Korea doesn't necessarily involve a collapse of the current leadership.
The fact of the matter is, we don't have a hostile policy. We have a denuclearization policy.
Washington's point man on North Korea, Sung Kim, reportedly failed at a recent attempt to engage with the North in a third country.
While Kim has said the U.S. has always taken a two-track approach of enforcing sanctions and keeping the door to dialogue open, it seemed odd for the administration to make such a conciliatory gesture immediately after imposing new sanctions. Analysts suggest with the latest proposal, the administration sought to hold the North accountable for the impasse rather than actually resume talks. North Korea chumming up with Russia as of late is also not a welcome development for the U.S., especially as Moscow has invited both the South and North Korean leaders to its World War II commemorative ceremony in May. And that, according to some analysts, prompted President Obama to cause a stir. All in all, crises in the Middle East and Ukraine, along with prolonged deadlock in the North Korean issue, are thought to have diverted the White House's attention away from Pyongyang. Choi Yu-sun, Arirang News.
Now, in another sign, North Korea is seeking to bolster its ties with Moscow. Latest reports say the North's trade minister is embarking on a week-long trip to Russia. Citing sources in the Russian capital, Seoul-based Yonhap news agency says Lee Yong-nam is expected to arrive in Vladivostok on this Monday and then travel to Moscow later in the week. It's speculated Lee will discuss the prospects of bilateral economic cooperation with Russian officials. The North Korean minister could also talk about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un possibly attending Russia's World War II commemorative ceremony that will be held in May.
The U.S. government says its missile defense capability does not serve the purpose of keeping China in check. The State Department, citing Assistant Secretary for Arms Control Frank Rowe, said the U.S. missile defense system aims to defend American territory from attacks involving intercontinental ballistic missiles, but doesn't affect either China or Russia's deterrence. Rose added Washington's ground course missile defense system, a key part of its defense, is for countering North Korea and Iran's ballistic missiles. The comments come after Beijing expressed strong opposition to Washington's interest in deploying its hit-to-kill anti-ballistic missile system, also known as the THAAD system, to the Korean peninsula. China fears such a move would compromise its strategic security. And shifting gears, Korea's shipbuilding industry was once one of the main driving forces for the country's economic growth. But after being hit hard by the financial crisis, it is losing its top spot in the global market. And according to the OECD, the sector is now posing a rather serious threat to the domestic economy. Kim Min-ji explains.
Korea's shipbuilding industry is facing serious challenges to getting itself back on solid footing. This according to a recent OECD report that says the global economic crisis has dented the industry's finances. The profitability, or EBITDA to sales, of publicly traded Korean shipbuilding companies in 2012 stood at around 5% in contrast to the 11% in 2008. EBITDA refers to the earnings before the deduction of interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization expenses. The figure also falls short of the levels recorded by companies in Japan, China, and Germany. The OECD report also points out the ability of Korean shipbuilders to generate enough profit to pay off their debts has significantly decreased since 2007. It says while their average debt levels were less than 1.5 times larger than their profit in 2007, the ratio was above 6 in 2012. To be financially stable, a company's debt level should not be more than 3 times its profit. Korean companies have also been more focused on short-term debts, which has forced them to resort to external funds to cover their losses, which the report warns could multiply their debt levels and decrease their investment. The situation has also led to an increase in government involvement in the shipbuilding industry, with government agencies increasing their ownership role in the industry. And with the increased volume of export guarantees granted to the shipbuilding industry, the government has become more exposed to risk. The report also warns the large size of key shipbuilding firms and their ownership links raises concerns of effects on employment if restructuring becomes necessary and a domino effect on the wider economy. In dealing with the aftermath of the crisis, the report says the government needs to manage its risks as well as maintain its neutrality amid the competition in the industry, and also consider the potential costs and benefits of the intervention. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, despite falling oil prices, Korea's oil consumption has dipped to its lowest level in 3 years due to the economic slump being felt here. The Korea National Oil Corporation says the country used 822 million barrels last year. That's down nearly 0.4% from the year before that. In particular, consumption of kerosene, mainly used for jet fuel, fell 18% to just over 15 million barrels last year. The Korea Energy Economics Institute attributes the fall to the slowdown in China, which is Korea's #1 trading partner. Last year, China's economy grew at its slowest pace in almost a quarter of a century, at 7.4%. Exciting news for tech fans because the Mobile World Congress opens next week in Barcelona. It's one of the main places where you can catch the latest trends in telecom gadgets and technologies. Strategy Analytics has listed Samsung's latest Galaxy smartphone as one of the key gadgets to keep an eye out for. The Korean firm is set to unveil the Galaxy S6 to the public on March 1st. This is a day before the official opening of the Barcelona event. Strategy Analytics also says smartwatches will be hot at this year's Mobile World Congress. Samsung and LG are anticipated to unveil their latest smartwatches ahead of the highly anticipated release of the Apple Watch in April.
Chinese tourists are visiting Korea in ever larger numbers, and they generally spend a lot of cash during their stay shopping, eating, and at casinos as well. So the government is stepping up efforts to build resort complexes equipped with these casinos.
Yes, and this time the government is allowing Korean companies to jump on board as well. This week in our Industry Insight, our Kim Ji-yeon takes a look at the challenges and also the rewards for Korea's blossoming casino industry.
Will the opening of resort complexes equipped with hotels, shops, and casinos bring investment and boost the economy? The Korean government is betting it will. It believes it can raise $1.8 billion from the casino industry. Now it's letting Korean companies get in on the bidding, a privilege once reserved for foreign investors. Just last month, the Ministry of Strategy and Finance gave the green light to the development of 2 additional foreigner-only casino and resort complexes in the country's free economic zones. It plans to select the 2 licensees by 2020. Already, the country has attracted investors for 2 complexes on Yeongjong-do Island located in the western city of Incheon. The Korea-based Paradise Group and the multinational casino firm Caesars Entertainment Corporation are each building a resort complex there. Both are seeking to be the Korean version of Singapore's Marina Bay Sands, which raised $5.4 billion in sales last year. But challenges lie ahead if they're to survive in the competition against the massive casino and resort complexes in Macau and Okinawa. But mainly, there's a China risk factor. The income of casinos in Korea is heavily reliant on visiting Chinese tourists. That's because the Korean government currently bans its nationals from all casinos except one. The casino in northeastern Gangwon-do province, Gangwon-land, is the only one Korean nationals can go to. The other 16 casinos rely on those with foreign passports. The tourism ministry says the combined sales of foreigner-only casinos is at $1.2 billion, similar to that of Gangwon-land.
The restriction placed on Korean nationals will affect the competitiveness of the Korean casino industry. The scale and amount of investment in the resort complexes is going to be smaller than in other neighboring countries.
Korea is capping investments in its complexes at $900 million a year, a figure far below that of its rivals. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping is increasingly trying to root out gambling as part of an anti-corruption campaign. That has raised fears the Chinese government will restrict its nationals from gambling, both home and abroad. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Well, it's time now for a look through the global headlines. We're following this hour from Seoul. For that, we connect live to our Eunice Kim, standing by, as always, at the News Center.
So Eunice, a peace march to commemorate the one-year mark to Ukraine's uprising turned deadly over the weekend when a bomb explosion killed at least 2 people and injured several others.
Yeah, that's right, Jin-joo. It was a rally that took place across Ukraine, including the capital of Kiev. The Ukrainian government is pointing the finger squarely at Russia, who it says provided the weapons to the separatists. Our Connie Kim reports.
Unrest is spreading across Ukraine after a deadly explosion rocked the northeastern city of Lviv on Sunday. At least 2 people were killed and more than 10 were wounded in the blast at a peace rally marking 1 year since the uprising that ultimately toppled the Russia-backed government of Viktor Yanukovych. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko says the bombing was aimed at destabilizing the country.
Our opponents, our enemies, have tried to destabilize the situation in the country. As you know, there was an act of terrorism in Kharkiv, and our special security services were able to prevent an act of terrorism in Odessa.
Sunday's march was to commemorate the 100 people who were killed during last February's uprising and the more than 5,000 who have lost their lives in the subsequent crisis in eastern Ukraine. 4 people have been arrested in connection to the bomb attack. Kiev says all the suspects have links to Russia and received instructions and weapons from the Russian Federation. Moscow has yet to respond to the accusations. The Ukrainian government is becoming increasingly concerned that pro-Russian forces are moving beyond regions held by separatists. Lviv is Ukraine's second city and has been the site of violent protests by separatists over the past year. Hours prior to the explosion, the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian separatists agreed to pull back heavy military equipment this week, following a deadline set during peace talks in Belarus earlier this month. Also, in the first and rare sign of progress toward implementation of the peace deal, the first prisoner swap of roughly 200 men took place over the weekend. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
The death toll in the Bangladesh ferry capsize has risen to 66 as emergency personnel continue to comb the Padma River for survivors. A regional police official said 23 more bodies were found when the double-decker vessel was retrieved, adding to the toll recorded on Sunday night. He said more than half of the confirmed deceased were women and children. An investigation has been launched to determine the cause of the capsize, with the captain and 2 crew members in police custody. Authorities say the overcrowded ferry tipped over when it was hit by a cargo vessel some 40 kilometers northwest of the capital of Dhaka. Bangladesh, which does not require formal passenger lists, is no stranger to ferry accidents. At least 7 people were killed in a similar accident just weeks ago on February 13th. And hundreds of Turkish forces entered and exited northern Syria over the weekend in a swift 9-hour operation to relocate the remains of a historic tomb. Ankara said it evacuated the remains of Süleyman Shah, the grandfather of the founder of the Ottoman Empire, from an enclave it considers to be its sovereign territory. They moved it and the 38 honor guards securing it to an area closer to the border area. Bashar al-Assad's government condemned the operation as a, quote, flagrant aggression. Meanwhile, the Islamic State group released a new propaganda video, this time showing 21 caged men in orange jumpsuits who it says are Kurdish Peshmerga forces. A man in the video in Kurdish calls on fighters to give up their struggle against IS or face a fate, quote, under the ground.
Now, how does the world view Korea 60-plus years after the Korean War? There were definitely some good traits about Koreans and their society, but of course some negative aspects as well. Our Connie Lee has her fingers on the pulse.
So how do you view Koreans? A new survey of about 1,100 foreigners in Korea and abroad reveals both the good and the not-so-good perceptions of Koreans in the world. The survey, conducted by Korea's Institute for International Trade and reported by the Gyeongyang Shinmun, asked foreigners for their insights. Let's take a look. First, at the good. Koreans are seen as hardworking, with more than 21% of the people surveyed saying so. Then, they're seen as kind and patriotic. On the flip side, though, a not-so-good perception of Koreans is that they're too pressed for time or rushed, while 14% see Koreans as too prideful, and 12% see them as unsociable. So if Koreans are seen this way, let's take a look at how Korean society is viewed. The survey points out the merits of Korea's good customer service, the nation's unified spirit, and Korea's dynamic social scenes. But to the bad parts of Korean society, more than 30% of foreigners say it's too competitive, while what they characterize as Korea's attitude of superiority is also seen as a flaw. And while the term 빨리빨리, or quickly, is emphasized here in Korea, it is also seen by the world as a negative. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Newsline at Noon.
Yes, no weather today, but do bear in mind that the yellow dust is very high today, so take precautions if you're heading outside and in Korea, of course. And you can join Jin-joo and I at the same time on Tuesday. Until then, goodbye.